Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Digital Empathy Lounge, brought to you by Answeralytics. Now, if you've not come across the Digital Empathy Lounge before, this is a podcast series that explores the best or next practices in experience management, and particularly what the best or next experiences should look and feel like. Now, today, I'm in conversation with Frank Buckler, who is the founder and CEO of Success Drivers. Hello, Frank.
Hi, Peter. Nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Now, Frank, before we begin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role and about Success Drivers?
So I'm Frank. I'm the founder of Success Drivers. And basically, my mission is to help business leaders making better business decisions. And we do that with so-called causal machine learning. So we use AI, and my whole story with AI started with the first buzzword wave of AI, which was 93 when the first headlines came on. I was a student at that time, and from then on, week after week, I was studying artificial intelligence, was programming it. I wanted to predict the stock markets. And fast forward, we took the technology, and while studying marketing, I found, okay, there is something like causal analysis, which science is doing, but with machine learning, you can do it much better. Yeah, so that's what my whole PhD studies were about. And later then I discovered that's fine for science, but it's really useful for businesses, because actually what every business leader and every inside leader wants to know is, what should I do to be more successful? You're looking for success drivers. That's how the company name comes from. That's the question everyone has every day. It's a causal question. And the technology we developed is the best answer to that you can have.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Now, you and I have talked a lot in the past about what motivates people to do what they do, the role of empathy and emotions, and of course, AI. We both have a common background in that. And I just want to explore one of those things that you mentioned there. A lot of businesses do reporting, which is reporting on facts. But you and I have talked in the past that facts don't always equal truth. So I'd like to understand from you, what do you mean by that? You know, surely facts are truth, aren't they? And if not, could you give us an example?
Yeah, so it's really important to understand what is truth and what do you mean by truth. Of course, facts are truths, but humans fail into the trap to jump by looking at facts to see conclusions. And facts do not equal conclusions. I give you tons of examples, maybe 3 or so. People see in the news always planes are crashing, right? So because there are negative news always, this shapes how we think. And when we look at such a plane crash, it's awful. And what we learn from this fact that flying is dangerous. 42% of people are anxious about flying, 42%, but the likelihood to be injured is 1 of 11 million. To die from a car crash is 1 to 100. So it's totally wrong insight. Maybe another story is, for instance, the bomber in World War II. They came back. They were typically had holes in the middle. Yeah, and the military said, "Oh, we need more ammunition there." Yeah, so that's what they learned. They already jumped from seeing these holes to a conclusion, which is wrong, because it didn't help. Because you need to look at the bombers who come back and who don't come back. Yeah, they don't come back because they were hidden somewhere else. Yeah, so you cannot see conclusions in facts. Maybe another example: when you ask customer about their opinion, and we do this with our product CXAR all the time. Typically, you see topics which are most often mentioned, right? So, for instance, customer or customer sonos, most often mentioned is great sound. So obviously, you see most people mention a great sound. So obviously that's most important, because this is how they reason their rating. Yeah, or but what we found is it's not predictive. It's just an association close to the category. They start mentioning that, but it doesn't mean you need to improve that. You find that with predictive technology. So maybe another example from our customer Microsoft. What customers say sometimes is, oh, by the way, I would like to have this and this feature in the software. Yeah. So what we see is that when people mentioning that they want to have features, these are typically the people who are super satisfied with the software. Actually, it would not help anything to integrate this feature, because you can prove that with predictions that it is just an indicator of their satisfaction, that they tell you more about what they maybe love to have. So again, facts, we always jump by looking at facts into conclusions, which is intuitive, but leads to totally wrong conclusions.
Yeah, that's a great point, Frank. And I've often had to have conversations with people about the difference between a correlation and causation. And a fact without the context or causality, as you say, can easily lead you astray.
Yeah.
Those conclusions we get to. And the story I used to tell was, everybody who ate bread in the 16th century is now dead. Ergo, bread must be deadly. Of course it isn't. So even when you have an irrefutable fact, without the interpretation, without understanding the underlying causality, it doesn't help you achieve anything. Exactly. Now, you mentioned voice of the customer programs and the way that we get feedback. And again, something we discussed in the past was that there may be a downside to just giving feedback back to people in the business, in the front line, without any interpretation, without any context. So tell us a little bit about that. Have you seen that as well, that there are downsides to just giving feedback back to people in the front line?
Absolutely. So, I mean, that's the most natural thing. That's a core strategy of CX programs, to give the verbatim back to the front line. And it obviously makes sense, because then they can really see and how customers respond. But if you consider that actually the most often mentioned topics are not important, then you would need to think about, what do your front line learn by reading that? So when you start reading it, what your brain does intuitively is, okay, every second statement is great sound. Yeah, he will learn, oh, it's super important for them to have great sound, which is not, it's not the case. Yeah, it's, of course they want to have great sound, but it's not important to improve that further on. So the learning can be quite wrong. So what you need to do instead is to structure the feedback. It's not, I'm not in favor of lying. So of course you always need to tell the truth to everyone, be transparent in a very simple way, but you can do that by simply structure it. Yeah, making the first batch is comments from the most important topics, the positive ones, then the negative ones. It's also, you can integrate here the feedback rules. First positive, then negative. Yeah, so this way they adapt the feedback also better. Yeah, so first important, first the positive, and then the negative, and then the less important ones. And people typically learn most from the first verbatims they read. It's a typical effect that the hundreds feedback, they just categorize it somewhere. Yeah, so it's super important to frequent the right in the inner loop.
Yeah, Frank, and that is such an important point, because I see so many voice of the customer programs who, they show word clouds and they look at word frequencies, and if a word is mentioned frequently, it must be important, right? It must have significance and relevance. But as you pointed out a little earlier, if you're asking people who are already very well disposed towards your brand what they think and feel, what they do is get into a co-creation role where they start to tell you a little bit more about how you can improve. But if you're not listening to the people who are actually dissatisfied or are struggling with some element, what they're actually telling you are the things that you're not doing, the things that you perhaps could improve. So that, frequency isn't just the only determinant of importance. It is significant, of course, but you also have to look at that context, and does it actually lead to a change in behavior, either with your customers or with your own organization? Because if you gather all this feedback and you don't do anything with it, and especially if you don't do anything appropriate with it, then really all you're doing is listening without hearing, I guess would be how I would.
I mean, there are even, or the most interesting topics customers mention are often not frequent because you are not so good at it. They don't mention it so often, but those who mention it, you can sometimes prove that it was really important. So you need to tell this everyone, or you need to make this a singular experience everyone should have. So it's obvious if you get it, it's obvious, but yeah, but what you need is basically a technology which helps you understand what's important. And this is can be not seen in facts. It must be inferred by the causal machine learning technology.
Yeah, and that leads me on to the next thing I'd like to talk about, because you and I share a common interest. We're both interested in what motivates people and how we can identify that from what they say and do. And you've mentioned a couple of times causal analytics or causal modeling or causal machine learning. So could you, in just a few moments, explain to us what that is and how should you use it?
Yeah, I mean, there is some misconception around, yeah. So some especially statisticians or so, they even don't dare to use this word because you cannot 100% prove causality. But when I talk about causality, I mean the fact which every businessman does every day. Yeah, if he takes a decision, he makes a causal claim. Yeah, so every decision is based on a causal assumption. So when I talk about causal analysis, I mean methodologies which use as much intelligence as possible to make this causal claim better. Yeah. So and we built this technology based on Granger's work. The Granger causality, you can Google that. He won the Nobel Prize for that, and he had a very simple finding. His finding was, if something is predictive to an outcome, and you can exclude that there is nothing else influencing input and output, yeah, that's a closed vault assumption. If this is the case, then it is causal. If it's predictive in a multivariate sense, not correlative, predictive, then it's causal, assuming there's nothing else, no confounder in the world. So what you can learn from that is you need to build holistic models, gather as much data as possible, control the model with confounders, meaning basically all kind of data you have about the context, yeah, demographics, whatever you put this in the model, and you also construct not just input-output relationships, but networks. Yeah, for instance, what you do with customers, it influences how they see the service, how they are satisfied, how they are loyal, how they are. So it's a chain, it's a causal chain, and typically the things you're measuring are not input-output. They are somewhere in this causal chain, and that's causal modeling. You simply get a lot most data you can get and connect it in a causal manner. Use causal machine learning to learn from this data.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. And that is so important, because I see so many people who they go through the first iteration of their business for CX improvement, and they measure things and they get these facts and they look at the facts. And the very next question is always, well, what's driving that? What is driving it? And your point about it is often more difficult to establish causality. Correlation is relatively straightforward compared to establishing causality. But when you do, you end up with a causal chain, which says we can go all the way from understanding what is a driver through to the impact on the bottom line. And that is what business leaders want to know. Yeah, and especially they want to know it of our CX programs. If we do these things, what will be the impact, not just on customer satisfaction, but for all our stakeholders, whether that's our financial stakeholders, government, society, the wider environment. So establishing causal links is, I believe, absolutely the foundation for the next generation of customer experience software. So thanks very much for sharing that with us, Frank. And for those of you that'd like to find out more about Frank's work and causal modeling and causal analysis, and CXAI, the products available from Success Drivers, you can find links within the comments below. But that really brings us to the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. So if you would like to find out more about how to subscribe, look in the comments. And if you would like to take part, you can look in the comments to find details of how to do that too. At this point, all that remains is to say, Frank, thank you very much. I know we could talk about this for a lot longer, and I'm sure we will in the future actually explore a lot of this further, because you and I, as I say, we're both very interested in why do the people do what they do, and ultimately causality explains behavior at the end of the day. If it doesn't, it's interesting, but it's not necessarily useful. Yeah. But on that thought, I just want to say thank you, Frank, and goodbye.
Thank you for having me. See you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.